routine. You wake up every morning, you eat, you have a life, whether it be going to school or going to work or having a purpose. You have a plan. But with that life, there's always this underlying thing behind all that, which is the worry. What do we do? How are we going to solve problems? How do we make decisions? All of that is this extra burden that we carry throughout that routine. Free to rest. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? This lesson is very interesting. There's so many different things to gather from it. There's so much information that you should learn. So it's so vast that I'm not going to touch everything. If you haven't been able to study or read any other lessons, this is the lesson to study because there's so much to take away from that. Specifically because right now, the world that we live in, it's so perfect. It's made for this time right now. Why? Well, Free to Rest is the title, but it dives in deeper. It talks about that burden that we have internally, and it talks about this healing from two sides, the physical and that spiritual, emotional, that deeper, that no one else can see, that problem. And this lesson, for that reason, I want to just focus on the bigger portions of the lesson to explain that, specifically the two stories that are used as examples to dive deeper to understand exactly what it's talking about. So to understand, the big thing that we look at, everything that we feel and experience in life, right? All the stuff that we're doing, it matters to us. It's something personal. And for that reason, we start feeling this strong need to control and to do things and to have that importance with that. But we carry a lot of that baggage when we make mistakes because we're trying to make the right decisions, but a lot of times it ends up backfiring. And that's kind of where the lesson starts with this paralytic, the person who shows up to Jesus and he's had more than just physical problems and deformities, right? And he's looking for healing, but not just that. It's interesting because in the lesson it says that Jesus forgave him first for his sins. So he basically healed something that no one else could see. And that's interesting, that little tidbit, because everyone else just said, oh, it's easy to say to forgive, right? That's something that anyone could do. But to that paralytic, he understood and knew. And then Jesus healed him anyway. So this deeper healing is very important. And Sunday, for example, it talks about how this burden, right, that we're carrying, and shows a lot of those internal things, like I said, for the paralytic, and it jumps over into Monday talking a bit more about that. But I like how it switches over to Elijah as well, because I think Elijah has a very interesting story. There's this fact that is touched on that the lesson touches on in Tuesday, saying how there's 300 million people a year that get sick from some sort of mental, emotional side in our minds, where we just, through the consuming burden that we have, whether it be depression, stress, it affects us somehow. That is very interesting because it's showing the power of how depression and all of this can impact us. And why does that matter? Well, right now, us being living throughout COVID, having to deal with vaccines, having to figure out what do we do, right? Everyone is having other sides. We are hearing about wars now. We're seeing what's happening with Afghanistan. We're seeing all of these calamities happening around the world. How do we figure out what to do with all of these things, right? We have so much of that burden. And here we see the story of Elijah, where he just went through this amazing experience. God has put him in front, right, to lead the charge, to help show Israel how they should be acting and what they should be doing. And he just had this amazing moment where he showed God's power, he showed the truth, but in spite of all of that, it doesn't matter. They still sent out a death threat, right, to capture him and kill him, and that just demoralizes him. It's interesting for me to think because a lot of times we wonder, right? I've heard this said a lot of times to me where we act a certain way and it's great, people can see who we are, but what really matters is when things are down. Because when things are great for us, the way we act is great, fun, whatever. But is it different when our worst, whenever things are horrible, if I act terrible toward everyone and I lash out and act violent, but it's only when I'm extremely stressed and when things aren't going my way, people would judge that, right? Because it's interesting as an artist, if I'm, for example, showing my portfolio for photography, the worst picture that I have is going to kind of be the baseline that shows how everything else compares to that. That kind of becomes the standard, my worst picture. So you got to put your best. So the same way with our stress, no one is going to look and say, oh, 90% of the time he is amazing, but if he's stressed, then he's terrible. So that matters, right? So here, I bring that up because Elijah just had this whole example to Israel, and then when things got worse, he crashed and couldn't handle that and just spiraled into depression. A lot of times we think, oh, Christians can't be depressed because we're Christians, we're following God, He transforms us. But here we're seeing a prophet who was so close, right, that he was taken to heaven, and how is he acting here with this depression? So he is just completely done. And like that, we have this burden as well a lot of times, because it's not something that's, oh, it doesn't happen. It's very common. Like I said at the beginning of the lesson, where the way that we act, the things we do, it starts consuming and stays in our mind. To me, this is very interesting, looking at how God treated him, even though Elijah was just done with. Look at this quote. This seemed to be the case for Elijah. It was all too much for him. He said, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." He was done, basically. There was nothing more for him. He just willing to die. That's crazy, right? And look at this other quote. "We may have no remarkable evidence at the time that the face of our Redeemer is bending over us in compassion and love. But this is even so. We may not feel his visible touch, but his hand is upon us in love and pitying tenderness." Basically, there is this side, right? Even though Elijah's acting this way, God is showing compassion to him. He understands. Why? Because when we're in this situation, only God can really understand. If we are stressing and having this burden, right? All these things that are happening in our lives, God is there helping us, being there for us. And to me, this is important because I've started feeling this a lot myself, worrying and trying to figure out what to do. What's happening is, this might even apply to many of you, we are looking at our lives, trying to figure out what is the best course of action. What should we do? How do we navigate, right? We don't know, but we need to think about it. We need to plan. We need to understand. And the more things get difficult, just like with Elijah, we're trying to figure out what to do. But with that, it also means that we're filling our minds with this worry and with these plans and decisions, that we're removing the space for God where He could come in and guide us and help us. Because we'll never know what we should do. We have no idea how we should act, what course of action, what we should do, right? This world that we're living in, what exactly should we do? If we're worrying so much about all these things, it's going to consume us to the point that we can't hear God's voice, that we can't see His guidance for us. Are we acting out of fear? Are we acting out of some sort of hatred, some sort of desire to be right? If we're doing these things for those reasons, then we're not looking to God. We're looking to ourselves. So that's why I think this lesson is vital, important, absolutely important, because this is becoming a little too common. If we don't know the answer, we're going to try to figure out. We want to make sense of what's going on around us. That's where that trust and God comes into place, where he is able to help. And we see that with the stories. To me, what's fascinating is how the disciples, they were completely afraid when that moment, that pivotal moment for Jesus, who the sacrifice was starting, where he was captured, and they were watching this, and all of them fled, right? And they couldn't handle that burden. But all of a sudden, after they were apostles and were preaching the word of God, how they were different, where Peter was in prison, and he was fine. He was sleeping in prison, and an angel woke him up, and he was freed. Or how you see followers of God singing in prison. What changed, right? Where the burden that the disciples carried, all of a sudden there was this shift, this difference. And the difference was because they were trusting in God, and they were letting him guide. Because yes, there's going to be problems. Yes, there's going to be all these things. But like Elijah, when he started thinking about what he had to do and not trusting in God, of course he wanted to die and felt like a failure, because that's how we'll feel when it's our own decisions and not God's. Look at this quote on Friday. With the continual change of circumstances, changes come in our experience, and by these changes, we are either elated or depressed, but the change of circumstances has no power to change God's relation to us. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he asks us to have unquestioning confidence in his love. Why? Because God knows what's important. He knows what we should do. There's no way that we could know. So if we're feeling that burden, I want you guys to maybe think, is it because you're looking to your life to make those decisions instead of letting God? And if that's the case, how can you get there to letting God choose? So I want to have that question. Are you making decisions for yourself, or are you letting God decide?